Hi, it's Penny Black and Jill Foster here for your next PB&J card class. And today I'll be making a card that features mainly dies, and the first featured die is our creative die Bodacious, which are those beautiful flowers. And real quick before we begin, here's a look at all of the supplies used in creating this card, including the ink colors, stamps, everything that I'm using. And I will put that back up at the very end of the video up on screen, so if you want to take a closer look at that time, you can just hit pause. So to begin, I've cut my Bodacious creative die from Canson 140-pound watercolor paper, and I'm going to paint it in using my Distress Ink re-inkers. So I'm just squeezing out some colors onto an ink palette, and I'm going to use those along with water and paintbrush to paint this in. I really love using these as watercolors because the color is just so intense. It's really bold and concentrated and bright. So there I've just got my water and my paper towel and my die cut. The colors that I'm using in order of lightest to darkest is Spice Marmalade, Barn Door, Fired Brick, and then for the greens I'll be using Peeled Paint. And I'm starting by just putting a layer of the Spice Marmalade all over the flower, and I've also combined that with some water, diluted it down with some water. And while that is still wet, I will go in with the Barn Door and add some shading. And I'm just rinsing off my brush and going in then with water to blend that into the Spice Marmalade. Again, while that section is still pretty wet, I'll drop in a little bit of the Fired Brick just to add an even darker shadow. And I'll just sort of follow that same process as I work my way around the flower. If at any time I feel like I have too much ink or it's too dark, I just wet my brush, and then to clean off the ink, dry it off a bit on the paper towel, and then go back in, and I can kind of suck up, or with that thirsty brush, remove some of the color that I've applied. So this is a pretty forgiving technique. If you do find that you're having your colors bleed, like the darker color bleed onto a petal where you don't want it to be darker, just work petal by petal and use a heat gun to dry in between petals, and that will help if you're having too much trouble with it bleeding. So if it gets too wet, sometimes the colors will just start moving all over the place. So the amount of water and how wet your die cut is will really sort of dictate how much control you have over those colors. So I'm going to continue to paint in the flowers and the stems and the buds, and I'll turn on a little music here, and once those are all painted, I will be back. Okay, now that that is all painted, I went ahead and dried it with my heat gun. And now I'm just going around the outer edges using my gathered twigs distress ink and an ink blending tool and a foam pad. And for me, this just kind of finishes off any white edges that might be showing through, and it just gives it an overall finished look to the die cutting, and it will tie it into the background that we'll be creating. So speaking of the background, this background features a border or a frame cut using the stitch stackers and then the beautiful leaf pattern creative die. And just real quick, I wanted to show you that even if you just want a basic frame without any stitching, you can use our stitch stacker set to just cut out that interior portion of your cardstock, and then you'll have a basic frame. So I love the stitching, but with this background that's pretty busy, I decided I just wanted something really simple. So it's just an extra way to get some use out of those stitch stacker dies. Now this is that beautiful leaf pattern die cut. I just love how this adds texture and interest to your background. Here I'm using it in a tone-on-tone look, so I inked it using a very light layer of antique linen distress ink applied using an ink blending tool and a foam pad. And I did sort of a pouncing motion for that just because of the delicate pieces on the inside of that die. And then I'm just putting tiny little dots of glue, and I'm going to glue that onto a piece of white paper. So you just get this sort of textural look. It's really, really nice in person. I don't think the photos quite capture how pretty that is. You could also do this in lots of different colors and make this leaf die the actual focal point of the card, but I just decided here to use it as a background element. Now I will add that frame, just keeping that in white, onto that leaf pattern. And then that piece is done. And just that alone offers so many different design options you could use on your cards or tags, just that simple die cutting with the frame. Now I am going to add a little touch of antique linen around the outer edges. And this just helps tie that into the background inking that is on that leaf pattern die. And I wanted this background to still feel white and bright and fresh, but also have sort of a vintage touch to it without going too dark. So that's why I've used a lot of the antique linen and just very small touches of the gathered twigs distress ink like I'm doing here around that edge. And keeping with that same look, now I'm going to do some stamping with our Footnotes transparent set and then the sentiment from the 3x4 inch transparent set called Serene, both by Penny Black. So I've pulled out my Footnotes stamp set and I've got the text portion. I have used this so much, you can tell my stamp is pretty much stained totally black, but it still stamps beautifully using this light antique linen ink. I am not applying the ink evenly across the stamp. I want there to be some areas of light and some areas of dark, as if it's just really old paper. And I'm just going to continue to do that as I work my way down my paper. I am stamping this in my Misti stamp positioning tool. This allows me to get a couple impressions with that antique linen ink. It's a really light ink, and so this way I can just darken it up a little bit by doing a couple of impressions in each area. And mostly this is just going to show around the outer edges of the card because our die cut element will be in the center of this card. So once I had that all stamped, and I'm sorry if it is kind of difficult to see here, it's pretty light. I'm going to add some of that antique linen distress ink around the outer edges. And by doing the stamping first and then the inking, you have a pretty good idea of how much ink you can apply before you start to cover up the stamping too much or get too dark. Now here are my die cut elements. Once I put those on there, I felt like the outer perimeter here just needed a little bit of gathered twigs. Now this panel is a standard size 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch panel, and it'll be mounted to a note card once the card is complete. To position my sentiment, I'm just holding those die cut pieces in place using the magnets in my stamp positioning tool. And then I'm stamping that using Ranger Archival ink, the mini ink pad in the color of potting soil. It's a really nice brown that ties in with all of the inking with the gathered twigs. And once I was done, I just added and adhered those elements to the note card. I also added a twine bow and a little brown pearl on top of the bow. I thank you so much for watching today. If you enjoyed today's video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can also connect with Penny Black on Facebook, Pinterest, Instagram, Twitter, and on our website and blog. And I'll link to all of those for you down in the YouTube description box below. And here are the supplies for everything used in creating this card. Thanks for watching.